I'm Jessica,
And I'm Tatiana.
and this is the People, Planet, and Prosperity podcast. And I'm from Cold Lake, Alberta. I'm currently in my third year of mechanical engineering, and I'm working for SFC.
I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, and I went to school in Ottawa. I graduated with a degree in environmental studies last year, and now I'm just back working with SFC. So, the purpose of this podcast is just to bring a balance into the conversation of topics like energy and the environment and resources, and just bringing in our own personal experiences and backgrounds to kind of balance that out.
And while doing so, eventually coming to a common ground between the two topics.
Yeah, so this is our first podcast of the series, and today we're going to be focusing on the topic of polarization in general, how we see it in our own personal lives, how that shows up for us in our own respective circles, and what better ways we can help bridge those gaps and come together in the middle. The first question is polarization in general, how we've experienced that in our own personal worlds and just school and home life and things like that. I know for me, I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, and I went to school in Ottawa. And so both of those places have extremely different cultures and worldviews and perspectives. So I saw a lot of polarization, I guess, between those two places. But for you, how do you find you experience polarization within your own kind of upbringing?
I guess the first time I really experienced it was when I came to Edmonton to go to university. Um, it kind of felt like, as I was advocating for oil and gas, it felt like a lot of people, might have seen me in like a negative light because of it. I think that the oil and gas sector gets a lot of flack for kind of no reason to me, anyways. Especially like going back and getting the chance to be able to work in the industry gave me just a whole new outlook on the people out there. I mean, I always loved everyone that I grew up with that was working in the oil and gas sector, but it growing up and getting to work beside them was a whole different experience. It was probably the most comfortable I've been in my life, to be completely honest with you. I got a lot of like being told when I was in school, you're not going to fit in out there. They might not treat you the best, and kind of had all these thoughts pushed into my head from people that were around me in the city. But when I got out there, it was so far from the truth. It felt like a family almost. They had my back, I had theirs. They were great to work around, like all of those men and women that are busting their butts out in the industry every single day. They have a lot to teach me, and it was just a whole eye opener. They do care about the environment. I mean, the energy sector had actually donated from between 2008 and 2018 $24.5 billion, which was like the highest investor in environmental protection that there was in Alberta at the time. So it's really hard knowing these facts and then hearing people tell me that the people out there don't care. They don't care about everyone else. They don't care about the environment. It's so untrue. Like the men and women I got to work around, they have the biggest hearts out there. Some of them are like some of my best friends still to this day. And it was just a really great experience. And I wish everyone could have that experience, because I think that the polarization would probably go away if they got the chance to work out there, see what they're doing, see, all the money they're investing in environmental protection. The conversation would be so much different.
Yeah, that's so true. That's especially for me, like growing up in Calgary, I didn't really have a close connection to resources in general, like not even just oil and gas, like just literally any resource, even like food. I had little to no deep connection to where my food came from, where I was getting it from, like things like that. Even the energy or the electricity in my home was kind of just, I mean, if you don't grow up seeing the behind the scenes footage, I guess, of what goes into it and how you get that there in the first place, it's just kind of like you have it. That's just part of what life is. You have that. It's definitely a privilege for sure, right? And so growing up for me, yeah, there wasn't a huge I guess connection to where those things came from and what it took to get to where they were now, like in my home, for example, or in my school. And I think also such a big thing with polarization comes from where you grow up. And there's so many varying perspectives from east coast to west coast, wherever you're from. Like you have such a different background than I do from growing up, and we've experienced such different things. So that really has a lot to do with what we think now, right?
Yeah, especially, joining SFC, I find that I learned a lot more about other perspectives, not just my own, which helped me understand why maybe people see things differently than I do, which is great. I mean, when I'm on my way to school, when I was in like elementary school, on the side of the road, you see like the oil wells and the tanks and stuff, and that's just like an everyday thing, right? That's just how basically the town runs is on oil and gas. So it's very natural, and then you come here and it's almost like a culture shock, I guess, in a way. But yeah, it's very different from the way that you, I guess, grew up.
Yeah. And even I feel like with polarization too, I mean, I think it can have a negative connotation to it, especially when it gets to the point where we can't have conversations and find common ground. But also, I feel like polarization, in a way, it stems from just having differences, right? Like polarization to me is kind of the extreme end of us having so many different opinions and perspectives and worldviews, which ultimately is a good thing, right? Like I think that's what makes us so strong, is that as a country, even, or even as people in this world, we have such a vast array of experiences and knowledge. And that, I think, when things get more tense or more serious or more extreme, then that goes to polarization, And I feel like for our generation specifically, for sure, social media has played such a huge role in polarization. Like I feel like when you're on social media, there's no such thing as common ground. Like common ground is not a concept on social media, like, at all, right? Like it's just kind of your left or right, you're black or white. It's just one side or the other, and there's not really an in between, which isn't indicative of how things, to me at least, are or should be, right? And it's just kind of crazy to see that, because as us, our age and our age range of high school to young adult, we are on social media a lot of us are, right? And so seeing that polarization on there really kind of depicts how we are in real life sometimes.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's really hard when you grow up in like such an extreme, I guess, one extreme to the other, especially when you went off to school in Carleton. It's basically the two of us were on two different extreme levels at that point, right? So it's a lot harder, I think, to think of a common ground because you grow up in a certain environment, and then all of a sudden it just that's what it feels normal to you. So then when someone tells you no, like this isn't normal, this isn't okay, we need to have a balance between the two, you're kind of confused because that's all you've known your entire life. So it
Yeah.
does make sense, but it is very important, I think, that we keep having conversations with the polarization, because otherwise we're never going to make any progress. We're
Yeah.
never going to be able to move forward when we're constantly fighting, versus if we come together and we think of solutions that are beneficial to both sides, then that's when you start making some real progress.
Exactly. No, I totally agree, right? And I think that's like, with that polarization, like I've seen, for me at least, I've personally experienced it in very different ways in both Calgary and Ottawa. So growing up in Calgary, I've been in circles or environments before where people um felt very strongly about resources, to the point where it became almost like a negative space. Like if I was advocating for environmentalism, there's some circles I was in where it was like I was outcast because that was part of who I was, or advocating for the environment was kind of laughed at. And I've been in circles like that where it's just like, oh, that's kind of like not fun. Whereas like when I was in Ottawa, there's moments where I'd be in circles of situations where it was just like I was in this position of feeling like I had a position that was kind of in the middle, kind of balanced, but to them that was perceived as being extreme or being just like completely on the other side of it, because I wasn't in full agreement with what they were saying, right? And there's a huge thing. I think it's different. Like when it comes to some people, they show that polarization in a way of saying, oh, well, that's silly. Like what you believe in, that's like silly. It's ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. And other people show it as like the cancel culture of, oh, well, like that's like, you believe that. Like, no, like that's not what we should be doing. It's not what we should be talking about. And so those two extremes, I've experienced them both. And luckily it's not the majority of my experiences for sure, but it's been interesting at kind of seeing that play out from coast to coast and seeing how there is a lot of differences for sure. But you're right, like in order to make solutions, we do have to bring those, not just those two groups, but all groups together to find a common ground, to find a middle, because there always is going to be a middle somewhere, you know.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's a lot to do with the fact that um when you're growing up, and especially for you in Calgary, I mean, you said you had more of an environmental background than I did, but it's really interesting to hear the fact that you have also kind of experienced the same side as me. I find that like almost really shocking, especially considering like you weren't necessarily as much into the oil and gas industry as I was. But it just kind of goes to show like there's always going to be an extreme versus like
Mhm.
you are such an advocate for the environment. I am too, definitely. But even you still experience that like you're not doing enough.
Mhm.
And that's kind of how it feels in the society right now. Like we can never do enough. And it's not like necessarily our job to solve all of the world's problems in one day. But it is helpful when you start, aiming and gearing towards getting to like net zero and trying to make our emissions as clean as possible, or trying to capture the carbon maybe, or something like that. But yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree.
So in your experience, why do you believe that your side or your environmental stance has such firm beliefs?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I would say, I guess I can't speak for the entirety of it, but I what I would assume if I'm trying to guess what the roots are of why these convictions are so strong on the environmental side is because I think environmentalism and sustainability is quite innate as a care, I guess. I think growing up with a deep care for nature, I saw nature as a friend, I saw it as alive, and I saw it as innate, like it had this intrinsic value of it on its own. And so I think for those who are very steadfast in environmentalism, or who have a lot of environmentally minded or ecological solutions within their own lifestyles, I think a lot of that comes from that belief of that the earth has its own innate intrinsic value completely on its own, and it's that has nothing to do with what it can do for us, right? Whereas other people sometimes see the world more for its instrumental value, so as in what it can give to humans and what it can do for us, right? um, so I think that it really is like an innately emotional thing, like connecting to the earth in an emotional or even in a spiritual way. It makes you see things differently. It builds your relationship with the earth, and there's a certain tenderness and appreciation for it that I think stems in, especially in a lot of indigenous tribes and communities worldwide, right? It's, we see the land as part of us. We are part of the land. It's being stewards of the land, right? Not wanting to deplete it or act as if we're separate from it is a big one for me and for a lot of people that I know. And I think it's just, that is a really strong thing. It's almost like you're protecting a dear friend to you, right? Like you don't want it to be seen as just a rock full of things to take from it. You want to see it as something that has such a beauty and a value to it, and has other life forms, plant and animal and ecosystems of its own that should be able to prosper, like with or without human intervention. You know what I mean? So I think that that's something that's probably a big root of a lot of people's concerns for the environment, is just that big core in the center of that, right? And just when we see how the earth has been treated in the past, and again, there's been a lot of really great changes and innovations and practices that have been elevated in the past few years. We've been seeing things get a lot better, but in the past there's been practices and methods that have damaged the earth and depleted it, and things like that, where you just, it hasn't been done in an altruistic way in the past, right? And so we see that and we want to preserve that and we want to make that different, you know? So I think that's probably a big core of why we, or why many feel so strongly about environmentalism.
Right. No, that totally makes sense. See, I guess the roots from my side more so. Of course, we still care about the environment. It's just a given. If we don't sustain the environment, keep it sustainable, make sure everything is green, there will not be resources for us to gather anymore. We won't be able to continue drilling oil. We won't be able to continue drilling for gas. it it's almost like essential. It is essential for us to be able to keep the environment intact while we are doing what we are doing. But I guess on my side of things, and maybe why people who I grew up around have such firm beliefs, is we can't live currently without oil and gas. There's just no other alternative that's strong enough or developed enough currently for us to be able to live completely without it.
Mhm.
So, in that sense, it's very important that we continue doing what we're doing and still keep the environment in mind, but it's we can't be hypocritical,
Mhm.
right? Like, it's of course we want cleaner energy. We want the earth to continue to be able to keep going for like our great grandchildren and on, but it's not possible to be able to have a comfortable human life without it. You'd be freezing in the wintertime. There's everything that goes into it, whether it's your house, your phone, your laptop. Oil and gas is a part of everything that we have. So nobody's going to give it all up. And we know that, of course. And it's, I think that's why it's so strong because, of course, we know that the environment needs to stay sustainable. We want to make sure everything is healthy, that animals have a habitat to live in and they're happy and healthy. But it's also just important that we make sure that we know we can't live without these like resources, without this industry. So we may as well take care of it as best as we can until a better alternative comes along.
Mhm. Yeah, I totally agree with that 100%. And I think that's something that many people on my side of things, quote unquote, may miss, right? Is that I think ideally we'd love to live in a situation where we don't have to damage the earth at all. And, we just don't have any impact on it. Like humans are just, this species on earth that just runs rampant and makes things worse, right? But I think that's kind of a flawed way of thinking because, of course, yeah, we have our faults as a species 100%, but also we are part of nature. We are intrinsically a part of the earth and living here we have an inevitable impact on it, like no matter what, it's just going to happen, right? Especially with population size increasing exponentially all the time for the most part. That's just a given. We are going to have an impact on the environment. And I think you're right. It is hypocritical to assume that we don't need these things when really a lot of us are living in situations where we haven't had to think about like what would happen if we didn't have that right now, you know what I mean? And so I think that that's something always to consider and to think about is that balance between let's make things better, and let's not kid ourselves and think that we don't have to take resources from the environment because we even if it's for shelter like our we need there's things like shelter, food, clothing, like just energy, like all those things we need as a species. And of course the earth is abundant enough to give that to us, and so it's not about not taking from the environment, it's just about doing it in a way that's more integrative and that's more regenerative, and doing it in a way where when we take from the environment we're not just depleting it but we're actually taking back or putting back into it what we took out, and kind of looking at how we can, I guess, reintegrate ourselves within the cycle, if that makes sense. And that's the thing too, right? Like, I think that it's not even just climate change. It's the environment has so many different topics and themes and issues that we can look at. Even something, for example, like fresh water in Canada. Like Canada holds 20% of the world's freshwater supply and 9% of the world's renewable freshwater sources. And so we have that resource that's available to us, right? But then, of course, we see the flip side if it's not taken care of properly, if we're not looking at things in a regenerative, restorative way, that removal of those vast quantities of fresh water from ecosystems, from things like agricultural practices or other uses that aren't the best for the environment, that can cause those resources to not be utilized in the most natural and efficient way, if that makes sense. So I think, yeah, it's always just important to rethink how we do things, and having that boundless consumerism isn't feasible. So thinking more circularly and thinking that we can actually take from the environment as long as we put back in and just kind of create that cycle in a holistic way.
No, I agree with that for sure. And especially like touching on that, I wish more people knew about the reclamation that goes into the oil and gas industry because exactly like you said, it's, replenishing what we've taken. So when you're digging, a trench for a pipeline to be put into, you're disrupting the earth. at that point. And there's no lie to that. There's no way around it. You have to do so. But when all is said and done, it's completely green. It looks untouched. You never know that there's a pipeline running through there. Like habitats are made sure that they aren't destroyed. Animals would be moved, relocated, and then brought back.
Yeah.
It's there's so much that goes into it to make sure that we aren't continuously taking and taking and taking. And sometimes, we have to disrupt it for a little while, which, I don't know a whole lot of things like that we do, whether it's construction, oil and gas, other resources where there isn't a tiny bit of disruption, but
Mhm.
it's always replenished and put back just as good as it was, if not better. So it's we're trying to stay as environmentally conscious as we possibly can. And like you said, like we don't want to continue with the mindset that we can just keep taking, taking, taking. We want to make sure that we have a sustainable environment and we can continue living the life that we live for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So after all of that, I just want to bring it back to the middle, bring it back to the center of it. After talking about all those different things, different topics, I wanted to see, in your opinion, that polarization, to me at least, is perceived. It's not really a real polarization because at the core of it, we have so much more in common than we have different, right? Like we both came from completely different upbringings and backgrounds, yet we agree on a lot of things. And so, in your opinion, do you think it's possible that this kind of dialogue between people like you and I is possible on a larger scale within our country, within the world? Or do you think that that's something that is easier said than done?
I think that's a really good question. I definitely think it is possible. I think people seem to forget that we all do have the same interests in mind, right? Of course, being in the oil and gas sector, I've noticed that when I come to Alberta or via U of A, I've noticed that a lot of people that I have had conversations with believe that the people who work out in the oil and gas sector are just money hungry. They're just doing it because they love the money and it's a great income source, whatever, they don't care about the environment. That's really untrue. I worked out in the oil and gas industry. I was fortunate enough to do so. And I got to meet a lot of these people, and they are all very charismatic about the environment. They don't want to inflict any damage onto it. It's always like in the back of everybody's mind. It's always there while we're doing our work. It's very important that basically everything we're doing, we're making sure that we are focusing on, okay, is this going to harm the environment? Is this good for the environment? Kind of what's going on. So I think we all have the interest in keeping the world sustainable, making sure that it's going to be here for a very long time. I just think that it's a very different way of looking at it. I mean, like you said, from your point of view, you sort of see the world as a living being, the environment as a living being. We see it as a necessity for sure, but we also know that, we can't live without these products. So it's just trying to balance both of those, trying to make sure that everyone has a very comfortable life and they're happy, they're warm in their houses, but also making sure that, yeah, this is like going to be sustainable for a very long time, that the environment, the habitats of animals, everything is going to be maintained, kept kind of pristine condition, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's so true. And I think that's the thing too, is that I think that's a really big kind of not elephant in the room, but it's a really big thing, a really big topic between a bunch of different people and different worldviews is that core thing of okay, like let's just go to net zero right now. Let's just like cut off all oil and gas, all fossil fuels, like stop it right now with good intentions. Of course, they want things to be cleaner and better in that way, versus people who are like, well, no, we can't do that. And it's the why in the middle for me, I think that would connect a lot of people together, right? I think that if we talked about that and said, okay, you know what, we know that we, as not just a country but around the world, there's people every day who are more waking up more to living in a more ecologically harmonious way. We want to do things that are more sustainable, right? And so when it comes to energy and resources, we obviously do want to get to a point where it's like net zero and it's more renewable and everything is getting cleaner and better all the time. But in order to get to that point, it's really not possible to shut things off right now, because even to make some renewable things like wind turbines or solar panels, you need certain energy from oil and gas that we've used in certain machines to actually excavate and like mine those things, or to do all those things you need to get the materials to source the renewable energy, right? And so I think it's just maybe a common ground that could be found in that conversation is, okay, yeah, eventually if we can wean off of it and be completely renewable, that's the goal. But we're not right there right now. And so if we know that that's the end goal, while we're still using oil and gas, let's make sure that it's the best standard, it's the best environmentally, and it's the best for people as well, right? And so also it's so cool too, because in 2019 Canada, I think, generated 67% of its electricity from renewable sources. And so we're already making so many amazing strides in that field, right? So I think that's really cool. And just I guess just to kind of close off on that polarization, is we have more in common than we think as a collective. Like if we were politicians, or if we were people that were like, I guess, in just higher roles, or more people knew about us, we would be expected or stereotyped to be against each other, right? Like we wouldn't be expected to have a conversation like this and actually get along, which is kind of sad, because for me, I'm like, differences make us all stronger as a people, as a country. It's never good, in my opinion, to be constantly in a yes room surrounded by people who completely agree with you all the time. It's healthy to be pushed, it's healthy to learn, to be educated, to also teach your own side of it as well, right? So I think that when it comes down to it, when it comes down to how can people, whether it's in our generation, students, young professionals, or anyone from any age, any background, if they want to start having these conversations with people, if we want to start having better conversations that are healthier and more balanced in the middle, it's from empathy, it's from understanding, it's from putting yourself in someone else's shoes and being willing to teach your own side, but also to learn. It's kind of that back and forth. It has to be a two-way street in that sense, right? And so the only way we're going to create solutions in any way that's long lasting and good for all people is to actually get down to the middle and to find that common ground.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, that's where you kind of learn different sides, and that's basically where I sort of got a more larger view about the environment, was having conversations about it with, even whether it was people who are outside of the oil and gas industry or people inside of the oil and gas industry. It's important to have these conversations so that you do learn. Otherwise, if you aren't and you're avoiding these conversations, you're not going to continue learning about these like industries, what's going on, and you're just kind of going to be stuck in your mindset, which it's not a great thing. Like you said earlier, it's not just black and white. There's a large gray area, and it's definitely possible for us to kind of come into it and make common ground.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, that concludes today's podcast.
Thanks for joining us.
Hope to see you guys next time.